Welcome to WriterCon, a gathering place for writers to share their knowledge about writing and the writing world. Your hosts are William Bernhardt, best-selling novelist and author of the Red Sneaker books on writing, and Rene Gutteridge, best-selling author of over 30 novels and screenplays.
Thank you, Jesse Ulrich, and hello, writers. This is our special Halloween episode, which is why I'm currently costumed as a mild-mannered writer doing a podcast in a weird deerstalker cap, but more about that later. My wife tells me that we're dressing as the Addams Family this year for Halloween. She will make a lovely Morticia. I'm not sure I really have time to grow a Gomez mustache, but I could be Lurch, or maybe just the Hand. Rene, what are you planning for Halloween?
Oh, Bill, I'm ashamed to say nothing.
What?
I know. Well, I've got my fall colors on today. Halloween's not my thing. I don't love dressing up. I feel like I'm always a low end costume. I don't know. I don't have. I'm so impressed with everybody's costume, and I enjoy watching everybody else's. But me dressing up is, I don't know.
No, do you get trick or treaters?
I do. We love to pass out candy. We pass out candy at our house. We're not that loser house that turns off their
I know.
And we get the good stuff. We get, we don't buy the cheap candy. So
What about you, Jesse? I see you going large with Halloween.
It really depends. Like, we will, if there's an event or something that we're going to, we will usually reuse a cosplay outfit we've had from one of the many conventions we go to. My favorite was we dressed as Black Widow and Hulk one year, but I was like half Hulk, like half my face was green, and we bought these contacts from China to make my eyes green, but I couldn't wear them because they hurt too much. I was like, you know what, like, the costume will survive without it.
Yeah, not worth it.
But,
Why not whole Hulk? Why half Hulk?
Half Bruce?
Yeah, I was half Bruce just because, like, I don't know, it seemed, one, because like we only had one big Hulk hand, and two, just so I didn't have to paint my entire face. I guess it was just a sort of ease of, and that was during like the Age of Ultron age when like they could like make Hulk return to his regular form by rubbing his hand. So I was in between. There was a reason for it at the time. I don't remember what it was. But
You were halfway through the transformational process, one
Yes.
way or the other.
yes, that was the goal.
Okay. Today, our Halloween appropriate interview guest is Leslie Klinger, editor of the new annotated Strange Case of Jekyll and Hyde, which was just released last week. This new edition, of course, like some of his previous books on Dracula and Frankenstein and Lovecraft, they give this classic tale its most complete and illuminating presentation yet. It's heavily illustrated, more than 150 full-color images, rare book covers, film stills, theatrical posters, and information about the real-life people associated with this story, all extensively annotated by this Edgar-winning author and editor. Publishers Weekly said, and I quote, "This will instantly become the definitive edition of this complex and influential piece of literature." Not bad, huh? Les will be talking about all the research that went into this new edition, and he'll debunk a few myths. But first, let's talk about the news. Okay, first news story. Amazon is changing its returns policy on ebooks. And I have to say, I first learned about this story when Jesse sent me an urgent text telling me that Amazon was changing its policy. I was in Florida at the time. I got out just in time, but I was in Florida for the Novelists Inc. convention, and I was literally going downstairs to go to a roundtable conversation on Amazon returns. So I got to show up and act much smarter than the average bear because I knew something nobody else knew. All thanks to you, Jesse. So many thanks.
I'm glad I could be useful because I was just I was so excited the algorithm actually helped me learn something first. So
You're always helpful. Anyway, we've talked in the past about many people's growing discontent with Amazon's policy, which allows buyers to return ebooks at any time, like even a year later, even though they've clearly read the entire book, which of course Amazon can track on ebooks. So basically, Amazon had turned into this big lending library, at least for many people. But Amazon is now stepping away from this policy that obviously did no favors for authors. Now they're saying they will only allow returns where no more than 10% of the ebook has been read. And beyond that point, if you want to refund, you've got to reach out to their customer service department and probably make a case. The change will go into effect by the end of this year. Renee, what do you think about all this? Is this a step in the right direction?
Oh, totally. I mean, if you're in any author circle, this was such breaking news, and everybody was rejoicing in my circle. And I think it's the total right thing to do. I mean, art, writing, subjective, like what the heck? And I would love to be a fly on the wall and hear the people calling into customer service
Yeah,
making their
right. What do you
case.
say?
I would totally love to hear those conversations, like, "Well, I didn't like how it ended." I mean,
Right.
I don't know, like, what do you so, anyway, yeah, good news.
Yeah, I think so. Jesse, what about you? I know you read wait, you're not one of those fiends that read ebooks and then return them, are you?
no, no, why would I do that? Like,
Okay.
l- you buy a book. Okay, you try to relate this to like real book buying. Can you return a real book? Like, there's usually a time frame in which you can return a book,
Yes.
whether you've read it or not. But most time you can't read it within that time. It is insane that Amazon, who knows how far you've read in a book, will let you return it once you have finished it. That's it. It is insane.
Yeah.
I am 100% on board with this decision. Like, it should be. I Yes, ebook pricing's a little weird, and yes, it is. I still believe you should get the ebook if you buy the physical book, but this is much better for authors. They shouldn't take money away from you a year
Right.
later just because someone took advantage of an easy return policy.
Right. Totally agree. Okay, news story number 2. Spotify has acquired Findaway Voices, which of course is a major distributor of audiobooks that we've mentioned many times before on the podcast. This story was also all the buzz at the Novelist Inc. convention, and I actually had a chance to sit down with reps from both Spotify and Findaway Voices and talk about it. With this new merger, Spotify will have access to Findaway's huge catalog of audiobooks, but apparently they aren't planning to make them all available to to Spotify subscribers. And when the ones that are will not be part of your normal Spotify subscription. Instead, they're going to sell audiobooks a la carte. And in other words, one at a time, whatever you want, you can buy it, but it's not going to come with your subscription. I mean, I assume that having used Findaway Voices myself with books we publish, I assume the contracts with authors wouldn't allow them to just, volunteer your books for a subscription service, which might allow people to read your book again without the authors being paid. Is there a trend here? I mean, and not a good one. Uh, they would have to pay royalties, and that would be hard to calculate if it's just part of a subscription. Anyway, Spotify is betting that it can build the audience for audiobooks partly by exposing its millions of users to audiobooks. Apparently, some they think for the first time ever. In time, Spotify is hoping to monetize this acquisition in other ways, like by offering people opportunities to advertise within audiobooks, which sounds dreadful, but I guess I could live with it, especially if it brought the price down. Renee, do you see yourself listening to audiobooks on Spotify?
Well, listen, I don't listen to audiobooks,
What?
but I have an opinion about everything. So, I think it's going to do well, actually, and I think people will be tolerant. I think of short ads. We're so used to that now on podcasts and Hulu, cheaper version, all those things.
Right.
And if they give the option to not have those for whatever price, I don't quite understand their pricing on it, but I think that the Spotify crowd will get behind this. I should also admit I'm not on Spotify, so really I shouldn't be talking about this, and I should just toss it to Jesse. But as an author, I would love to have my books on Spotify.
Right.
I've never listened to any of my books; they're all on audio, I believe. I've never listened to them because I just can't stand somebody to read to me. I want to read to myself. But Jesse, what do you think?
I mean, I'm amazed Spotify's still able to stay in this battle against Apple and Amazon in the sense of they still, I guess, have enough money coming in for music subscriptions to one, buy multiple podcast networks, buy their own podcast host. So now literally you can sort of just stay in the Spotify system, but still have a podcast that goes out to everywhere. And now they're doing this. I mean, I'm all for it. I'm all for the fact that they're leaving audiobooks to be sold everywhere because that makes the most sense for both them and audiobooks as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if this is a winning pricing model going forward. Um, like, will Spotify continue to make enough money for its investors to think all of these, million and billion-dollar investments they're making in buying other companies is worth it? So
Mhm.
I wish them luck. Anything that brings the price of audiobooks down or makes it easier for authors to maybe do like a continuing series, almost like a podcast in audiobook form, I guess.
Right.
Just like how Amazon's launching that, writing a chapter at a time sort of thing,
Right.
releasing
Mela.
yeah, there's cool things that could be happening. So we'll see if they do.
Well, if it increases audiobook sales, which means it increases author income, great. The question, I suppose, is will this
Will it?
really increase sales of audiobooks, or will it just siphon sales from other markets to Spotify? But
Yeah.
time will tell.
Yep.
All right, time for our special Halloween interview. Leslie Klinger is considered one of the world's foremost authorities on Victorian era icons, hence the Deerstalker today. Like Sherlock Holmes, that's one of his books over my shoulder, and Dracula and Frankenstein. He's the editor of the 3-volume collection, The New Annotated Sherlock Holmes, and now he has turned his attention to another creepy classic, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Les, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
All right, traditional first question. If you could give writers one piece of advice, what would it be?
Well, I'm not much of a fiction writer. I've tried my hand at a couple things so far, but it needs a lot of work. So all I can really talk about is the kind of books I write, which are books about books. So my advice would be, if you're going to do that, make sure it's a book that you really like spending time with, because you're going to be devoting a year or two to the subject. And so it needs to be a book that has great personal appeal. So this I guess does apply to fiction writers as well. I would say this, I would distill that advice down to write with passion.
Great advice. Congratulations on your new book, which of course is the annotated and illustrated edition of Robert Louis Stevenson's classic, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. What drew you to this project?
The project was in some ways sort of a natural extension of some of the other work that I've done. I've annotated Sherlock Holmes, I've annotated Frankenstein, Dracula. So the Victorian age really fascinates me. And this is the other great iconic work of that age. There's very few books that are remembered, or figures, literary figures, let me say, that are remembered in the 21st century, much less the 20th century, from that era. But they are Holmes, Frankenstein, Dracula, and Jekyll and Hyde. So I wanted to explore that.
And so you did.
Yeah. And so what were some of the surprises you encountered when you started researching the book?
Well, I knew, as many people do, I knew some of the films and certainly the Tom and Jerry cartoons and the Daffy Duck cartoons and all the wonderful adaptations that have been done of Jekyll and Hyde. But it had been a long time since I'd read it. And when I reread it, I was surprised to see how different it was from the adaptations. But the other big surprise was how masterfully crafted the book is. This is a book that was hailed by some critic as a mystery, a classic mystery, in which the solution is more shocking than the crime. And so there's a big surprise in the book. Everybody knows the surprise now, but there's a big surprise, which, spoiler alert, is that Jekyll and Hyde are the same person.
What?
And,
Okay.
and when you go back and read the book knowing the surprise, you can see what a meticulous job, what beautiful craftsmanship Stevenson exerted to weave all the pieces together, to put the clues in there so that it isn't a sort of out of left field surprise. It's all been building up to this. And had you but known that that was the way you were going to interpret the clues, you might have figured it out.
Sure. You mentioned all the adaptations. I have a memory of being a kid and seeing a musical version on television. Am I remembering this correctly? Musical
Yes.
Jekyll and Hyde?
Yes. And as I said, cartoon versions, comic book versions, stage versions, many, many film versions. It's been adapted, and it was adapted quite early. Like Frankenstein, it was on the stage almost within weeks of the book coming out. And interestingly, like Frankenstein, a misinterpretation. I mean, the first version of Frankenstein on the stage was a play called Presumption, meaning it was all about, humans shouldn't investigate certain things, science isn't necessarily good for you, etc. Jekyll and Hyde didn't have that kind of a title change, but again, the early versions of the play were quite different from the book. They were, if you will, simplifications of the book, and a certain romanticization of the book, in which there's a love interest. There's a part for a woman. The book has virtually zero women in it.
Right. I don't know if you saw this, Les, but about 2 weeks ago, as we're recording this, on the first episode of Celebrity Jeopardy, the final Jeopardy question turned on the question's allegation that Stevenson was inspired to write this story by a real life person who was, socially acceptable by day, but running a gang of thieves at night. Is this true?
I think it is true. It was one of the things in his mind. Let's say it was. Now, Stevenson wasn't just inspired by this. Stevenson actually wrote about that person. The character's name was Deacon Brodie. And Stevenson and his friend William Henley wrote a stage play about the Deacon. Deacon Brodie was, as you just said, a man who lived a very respectable, sort of church-going life by day, and by night he led a gang of thieves. And this duality fascinated Stevenson. I think there were other influences. Stevenson himself felt that he was living a hypocritical life. He had been, his parents had pushed him to become an architect. He was supposed to be designing lighthouses. He was supposed to be leading a respectable life in Eastbourne. Meanwhile, he was off hanging with the art crowd and writing, and eventually, of course, left England behind and sailed off to the Pacific, where he spent his final years. But he viewed himself as a hypocrite. And this subject of duality had been something very much in his mind. He wrote a story called Markheim, which explores some of the same themes. Of course, he wrote The Body Snatchers, which also has some of the same themes. But all of that must have been in his mind. He wanted to write about what he called that old war of the members for a long time. I think what he meant by that was the conflicts within everybody between our good natures and our bad natures, the reconciling the different aspects of our personalities. And This troubled him, and obviously he felt that it was a timeless topic. And then he had a dream. He had a dream in which he said he dreamt the scene at the window where Utterson and Enfield are walking, and they see Jekyll hanging out the window of his house. And Stevenson credits his brownies, meaning his unconscious mind, with the writing of this book. But as I said, from the craftsmanship that you can see, it's evident that that's a bunch of baloney. He obviously he was already a very talented writer, and he spent a lot of care on this book. Even though he wrote it in an incredibly short time, by the way. He wrote it in like 6 weeks.
Wow.
Oh, interesting. Well, so you've done a lot of writing before these two projects. How did you get started editing and annotating classic works?
Well, so this takes me back to law school. When I was so by the way, I still have the day job of being a lawyer. And so when I was in law school, I got as a gift the William Baring Gould annotated Sherlock Holmes. Wonderful 2-volume set that was published in 1968. And I was hooked by the idea of the cult of Holmes and the fascination with the minutiae and the, if you will, trivia relating to Sherlock Holmes. And I had this fantasy even then that someday maybe I would get to be the person who would update that book.
Oh, wow.
So flash forward to the mid 90s, and I said, maybe I don't need to wait till I retire, because I don't know when that's going to be. Maybe I ought to start doing this. And I started writing new versions of the annotated Holmes stories using Baring Gould's footnotes. Showed them to some friends, and they said, well, you can't do that. You can't just copy his footnotes and sort of add on to them. So I took that to heart and started rewriting them all over again. The first editions of the first collection is called the Sherlock Holmes Reference Library, and it's 10 volumes. And some friend said, Les, your writing style is law review. They didn't mean it as a compliment.
Right.
What they were talking about was the law review style of, one line of text on the page and the rest of the page is a footnote. So I got hooked on that writing style very early when I was on the law review a long time ago. But I loved doing it. My other self-explanation is that I was always one of these people who, unfortunately, with my wife, had to suffer through this, go to the movies and I'd talk to the screen. It's like, oh, that's just like this from that. Wait till you see this part. This is really good because it's like that. And so I eventually channeled that into more properly social channels of books, as opposed to talking to the screen.
Yeah, and some really terrific books, including that 3-volume edition of Collected Sherlock Holmes, which is now hovering over my shoulder. I had the Baring Gould versions too. I love those as well. Although I think you shown on your own. It's really a step up.
I stood on his shoulders. I always say that I had 3 big advantages over Bill Baring Gould. Number one, the internet, which turns out to be an enormous resource for Victorian research. Number 2, I had the DeWall bibliography, which was published in the 70s, and it was listed 25,000 pieces of Sherlockiana that I could reference. And number 3, I got to start with Baring Gould. So I could see that he'd written a footnote about something and say to myself, I guess I better write a footnote about that.
Yeah.
So it's always easier to be, as we say in Hollywood, the first to be second.
So you produced not only this definitive Sherlock Holmes collection, but this also led to a lawsuit involving the Conan Doyle estate. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So that came out of, not from the annotated. They liked that mostly. I paid them a license fee for some of the copyrighted stories and so on. But later on, my friend Laurie King and I were editing an anthology. The first one was called A Study in Sherlock. These were new stories by A-list crime fiction writers inspired by Sherlock Holmes. And the estate of Conan Doyle, which is a company now owned by some grand nieces and nephews of Conan Doyle, came to us and said, you can't do that. You can't use the name Sherlock Holmes as a character in the book without our permission, without paying us money and without getting a license. And we said, that's ridiculous. At that point in time, 50 of the stories were already in the public domain. That is to say, they no longer had copyright protection anywhere in the world. There were only 10 left in copyright. What could it possibly mean that those stories were in the public domain? How could that mean we can't use the name of the characters? So we decided to go to court, and we filed an action in the District Court of Northern Illinois, because that's where the estate had an office. We won. The estate appealed to the Seventh Circuit, where we won again. And the court wrote a scathing opinion, basically saying that the Conan Doyle estate was engaging in blackmail. They were extortionists. And the estate appealed again to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court turned down hearing the case, which then ended the case.
So it's over.
And so we won. And so the law is now, and it's very clear, that as long as you do not use character elements of the characters that appeared exclusively in the copyrighted stories, you are free to use the elements that appear in the non-copyrighted stories. Oh, sure. By the way, by this coming January, none of the stories will be in copyright anymore. Right now, there's still 2 stories in copyright.
Well, I mean, copyright protection already lasts far longer in the United States than anybody ever expected it would, right? So
yes, well, that's an interesting point. That you know, Mark Twain, back in 1910, Mark Twain testified before Congress on a bill to extend copyright to being the life of the author plus 50 years. At that time, by the way, today it's life of the author plus 70 years. So at that time, copyright was only essentially 28 plus 40 plus 14. It was 42 years. And Twain said, honestly, there's really very few writers who anybody's going to want to read 42 years after their books are published. But for those who have such work, who've done that kind of work, why are you taking it away? You know, how would you feel if you built a house for your grandchildren, your children and your grandchildren, and after 42 years, the government came around and said, oh, that's ours now?
Oh, right. That just makes sense. All right. So you've written about Sherlock Holmes, obviously, Jekyll, Hyde, Dracula, Frankenstein. You've also done annotations on at least 2 graphic novels, Alan Moore's Watchmen, Neil Gaiman's Sandman.
Yes.
Do you have a favorite amongst all these projects?
Oh, of my children, which one do I love most?
Yes, exactly. Pick now.
Not at all. Not at all. I love them all. And as I said at the top of the show, you have to love them or else you're not going to get through it. But I must say that Watchmen was a joy, in part because I got to annotate things that at first blush I thought were obvious. It's like, really? I have to write a note explaining about the Vietnam War and Richard Nixon and Watergate and those kinds of things, because that's now ancient history to modern readers. I mean, really, well, think about it. It's 50 years ago that those things happened. But the Sandman and also American Gods, Neil Gaiman's other great novel, both of those were very special projects because uniquely, Watchmen is a little different. I'll explain that in a minute. But uniquely, I got to actually work with the author. So nice. Neil was able to give me the original scripts for Sandman, and he was there to read my notes and to talk to me about it and to say, well, you missed this over here. You didn't quite get that part right. One of them was actually, he said to me, that's really interesting. I never thought of that. So very different experience to work with a living author.
No doubt. Well, Alan Moore is living as well, but I'm
Yes.
guessing you
So,
didn't have a sit-down chat with him.
right. So Alan, who wrote the introduction for my Lovecraft book and
Oh.
is a friend, Alan did not want to revisit Watchmen. He basically has washed his hands of Watchmen. He was so unhappy with the treatment that in his mind he received from DC that he just sort of never wants to go back and talk about that ever again. Dave Gibbons, on the other hand, the artist, so Alan actually burned his scripts.
Wow.
Dave Gibbons, fortunately, did not. And so he was able to provide me with the original scripts for the comics. And the scripts are marvelous because, so these are 22-page comics. Alan Moore's typical script would be 110 pages, 120 pages. So they are so detailed and rich. So I was able to work with Dave, and as in the case of Neil Gaiman, Dave similarly went through my drafts of the notes, gave me comments, suggested things that should be added, and corrected things along the way. It was a lovely experience. But Alan did not want to play any part in that.
I mentioned before that you've done books on Dracula and Frankenstein. I think most people are aware that Dracula, Bram Stoker, at least vaguely based on an actual historical figure. But what did you do with Frankenstein?
Well, Frankenstein, what I focused on primarily was to talk about, number one, the science of the day. This was a time in our scientific history when philosophers, natural philosophers, as scientists were known then, the word scientist, by the way, hadn't been invented yet, were fascinated by the origins of life, what made something living. And so this book was not an attempt to be any sort of scientific answer to that, but it was very much a response to Mary Shelley having heard lectures on this from friends, from her family's circle of intellectual friends, and she was fascinated by that idea. But of course, Frankenstein is also very much about parenthood, and the role of parents and the importance of parents in the life of someone growing up. I mean, many have said that Victor Frankenstein is the villain of the piece because he basically abandons the creature. Right. So you're right. Unlike Dracula, there's not any real history there. Although the Dracula history is pretty much made up anyway. All we know about Dracula, I mean, there's a lot of baloney about how Dracula is based on Dracul, the 14th Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracul, who was theoretically a vampire himself. Nobody ever said that. No, there were no historians that had ever said Vlad was a vampire. Did Stoker know about Vlad the Impaler? Yes. But all he knew was, because we know from his notes, all he knew was he thought the name was cool. He thought Dracula meant son of the dragon. This guy's father being Dracul. So Stoker loved the name, and we can see. And so one of the things I really focused on when I did Dracula was, again, the text. I was able to get my hands on the manuscript of Dracula, which was owned by the estate of Paul Allen, the Microsoft billionaire. And he allowed me to come spend some time with it and go through it page by page, line by line. And one of the things you'll see from doing that is that for a long time, the central character had no name. He was simply the vampire, where he was going to be called something silly like Count Wampir, but Stoker went back and changed it all to say Dracula after he discovered the name.
Well, he was right. It is a cool name, and it worked out, didn't it?
Yes, it's much more euphonious than Count Wampir, you know. Sort of, I am Wampir. It doesn't quite have the same thing.
Wow. Well, this is so interesting. So can you tell us what you're going to be tackling next?
Well, several things. First of all, an ongoing project, and we're only at book 15, is the Library of Congress Crime Classics series. So those are just what they sound like, American crime classics that the Library of Congress, together with Poison Pen Press Source Books, is republishing. I'm annotating each of those lightly. When I say lightly, the one I just finished is S.S. Van Dyne's The Canary Murder Case, and it has almost 160 footnotes because it just needed them. And there are just so many things in that book that need explaining, because the guy walks around, Philo Vance, the great detective, walks around spouting quotations in foreign languages, Latin and Greek, and the Bible and poetry and this and that. So it all needed references. But that's an unusually heavily annotated. So those are lightly annotated. We're 15 titles in, and as far as I know, that series will continue indefinitely. As far as a large project, we've been talking about titles. There's a good chance that the next one will be The Invisible Man, but we'll see.
Great.
Oh, fun.
All right. One last question. Since this is our special Halloween episode, I've got to ask, what are you doing for Halloween? You be dressing up or drinking potions or
I'll
what?
dress up as a lawyer, and that'll scare a lot of people.
Yeah.
That's
Good
great.
answer. Les, thanks so much for being on the podcast. This has been a real treat.
My pleasure.
Hey, we're still taking registrations for the WriterCon cruise, which is April 9th through the 16th. We leave from Galveston and have a really exciting Western Caribbean itinerary. Plus, of course, when you're in the WriterCon group, you get over 20 hours of instruction. Some of that will be group. Some of it will be smaller groups. Some of it will be one-on-one. We've got teachers plus an agent on board. Of course, what exactly we do will depend on who comes with us, and we'll talk to everybody in advance to try and tailor some programming that is really helpful to the people on board. Look at your work in progress or talk about the topics that you think you need some growth in, whatever it takes. That's what we're there for, to help you achieve your writing dreams and move everything to the next level for you. So if you think this, and of course you're on this big boat out in the middle of the ocean, and it's very scenic and a lot of fun and pools everywhere and oceans. So if this sounds like something you might want to do, please visit our website for more information. That's writercon.com, WRITERCON.com. And if you haven't joined the WriterCon Facebook group yet, do it now, all right? Do it today and join this wonderful community of writers. All right. Until next time, have a great Halloween and keep writing. Remember, you cannot fail if you refuse to quit. See you next time.